Hey guys, I'm Heidi Prieb. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. This month on this channel, we're talking about rupture, self-recovery, and repair. And a big part of what goes into repairing any conflicts in relationships is, of course, communication. But I think that when you go online in particular and you're looking for tools to help you move through conflict, a lot of what comes up is communicate, communicate, communicate. And while I'm definitely not here to knock that, there are so many problems that can genuinely be solved through better communication. I think it's also really important to be aware of and be realistic with ourselves about where that philosophy reaches its natural limits. There are a lot of problems you might find yourself struggling with in relationships where communication and the breakdown of communication is actually more of a symptom of the underlying cause than the core issue itself. So today we're going to talk about 7 instances where that might be the case and what is going to help if any of these are situations that you find yourself in, rather than trying to tackle the problem solely at the communication level. So again, it never hurts, but what we don't want to be doing is endlessly treating a symptom and ignoring the underlying cause. So, without further ado, we will get into 7 things that might not be communication problems at their core. First thing, trauma patterning. So, several years ago, before I'd really done any attachment or trauma healing work, I went to a couples therapist with my then partner. And like a lot of couples, we went in going, we love each other, we just have communication problems that we need to fix. And the counselor went, great. And we worked with her over the course of several sessions. And at one point, she said to us, I don't think the problem that you guys are having is communication. I think the problem is that both of you have pretty significant unresolved trauma, and neither of you are trauma informed. So neither of you know how to work either with your own trauma responses when they come up or with your partner's. And so, as much as we can have conversations about that while we're all regulated, what's probably going to move the needle the most for the two of you is to start looking at that trauma. And this was one of the best pieces of advice I think I've ever gotten. It spurred a lot of inquiry in both myself and my then partner into our own trauma patterning. But the point here is that if someone is in one of those 4F responses, so fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, essentially what's happening is that their body is outside of what we call the window of tolerance. Being inside our window of tolerance means that we're not too activated or deactivated, so we're neither too wound up to kind of think clearly, nor are we too shut down to think clearly, and we're able to absorb what's happening and choose how we want to respond to things. When we are outside of our window of tolerance, we might be either so angry that we don't care about any of the consequences of our words or our actions on other people, because we're in that fight energy that's telling us, I just need to get my point heard at any cost, right? So we lose the focus that our actions and our words have on the relationship dynamic. Or we might be in flight energy where we feel like we just frantically need to escape the situation, either literally or mentally by any means possible. Or we can be in a frozen state where we're totally dissociated from our bodies. We're not able to really log or take in what's happening around us and respond to it sincerely. Or we might be in fawn where we're not even aware of what our authentic wants and needs are, other than to keep ourselves safe by appeasing the other person. And when we're in any of these response patterns, the problem is that our communication is not coming from an integrated or regulated place. Okay? So all of these parts of us do hold important pieces of what keeps us safe and what we've learned to do in the world when we feel threatened. But if we're trying to solve relationship issues from inside of any of these 4 responses, it's not going to work. We do not have enough of our somatic selves online, of our cognitive selves online, to be able to reach any real conclusions when we're in any of these states. So, what solves this? When one or both people are in a trauma response, your best bet is going to be to stop trying to resolve the conflict, stop trying to communicate about it, and instead do whatever needs to be done for whoever is having that response to get back inside of that window of tolerance. There's someone named Dr. Bruce Perry who has this model that I really like for this that goes regulate, relate, reason. And his hypothesis is that if we want people to listen to any sort of higher order reasoning that we have, especially about interpersonal issues, the first thing that needs to happen is that both people need to be in a state of regulation. The second thing that needs to happen is that rapport needs to be established. And if we've been doing a lot of fighting with someone, we need to reestablish rapport over and over and over again. So both people need to feel safe and comfortable with each other. And then, usually, we're open to reasoning after that point. But if we're trying to skip those first two steps, or try to resolve major issues in their absence, it's not going to get us very far, and it's going to degrade the trust of the relationship over time. So again, noticing when one or both people are dysregulated, finding a way to relate to each other again in a way that feels safe and accessible, then trying to communicate is what we want to make sure we're paying attention to if we're dealing with trauma responses in a relationship. Second thing that better communication isn't necessarily going to solve is if one or both people are really incongruent when they're trying to resolve a problem. And incongruence, I will say, is often another one of those things where it's a symptom of something underlying rather than the core problem itself. But basically what that means is if you sit down to talk to someone and they are saying one thing and telling you they want one thing and their bodies are giving off a totally different vibe. So maybe they're telling you, I really want to resolve this conflict in a totally hostile voice. Or maybe you go over the same issues again and again, and they keep telling you they care and that they're sorry, but the behavior just keeps repeating. These forms of incongruence could be a lot of things, right? They could be overt deception, or more often than not, they indicate that that person has a fairly significant blind spot online. So maybe they believe that they can't share their true feelings with you unless they are feeling the perfect thing. So maybe they're kind of mad about something, and that's why their body is holding all of this hostile energy. But they have a story that they shouldn't be mad about that. And so they're saying the words that they think are appropriate to the situation, but their brain and their body are not really having a clean connection with each other. Another example of this could be a partner who continuously sets a boundary and then crosses it themselves. This might be an example of someone who is unaware of the fact that in some cases, they really feel strongly about one thing, and in other cases, they feel totally different about that same thing. So they're not really internally cohered on what they want. And of course, nobody is ever perfectly integrated or internally cohered, but some people are a lot more consistent and aligned than others in their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions. And when someone is really struggling to reconcile those things and get them in alignment, that's often work that really does need to be done internally first. And really, the only thing that solves that kind of stuff is that inner blind spot work. So that person doing the self-discovering of figuring out, why is it that sometimes I say I want something and then I act in a way that's totally opposite? Why is it that I think I want a relationship with this person, and yet every time I'm close with them, I just feel kind of prickly and walled off? It's really hard to solve that interpersonally if where the conflict originates from is inside of one or both people. And so where communication can help with this, to be fair, is that we can offer our perspectives if people want them, or we can share impact of how people are affecting us. So I've grown a lot through people saying things to me like, hey, I don't really know if you want to be my friend. Like, I feel like I'm reaching out a lot, but I don't feel like I'm getting super enthusiastic responses from you. I've had this happen to me in situations where I totally full force want to be the person's friend, and I was not aware that because of some of the patterning that I have online, I wasn't quite showing that emotionally. I wasn't conveying on my face and through my body language the excitement and genuine appreciation I felt for people that was happening internally. And so sometimes people can point things out to us that can be useful in helping us integrate more, right? But we cannot do this for people who don't want it. If people don't really want you to share about your experience with them in that way, that might just mean that they're not ready to resolve that internal conflict. And unfortunately in life, sometimes it's just like that. Lacking psychological integration often implies that somebody is still functioning in some sort of protective way. And maybe they need that protective functioning online because they're not in a safe enough place in their life to start doing that unpacking. And so we need to give people whatever grace we can give them in this process, but trying to endlessly push better and better communication on someone who just isn't ready to see the way their bodies, their actions, their feelings, and their words are not aligning is probably not going to get us very far, and it might even start damaging the relationship pretty quickly. Third thing that better communication is not going to fix is underlying entitlement. So there's this author named Lundy Bancroft who works with and writes about patterns of abuse in relationships. And he has this really brilliant way of thinking about it where he goes, when we meet a person who is, let's say, really racist, we usually don't go, oh, this person has trauma, they just need to unpack it and then they'll be less racist. We go, oh, this person has a pattern of thinking that involves distortions. And until that thinking changes, this person is probably going to go right on being racist. And then he says the same is true for people who have patterns of relational entitlement. So, a lot of the time when we meet someone who has something like those low empathy responses, or who is very uninterested in kind of doing the relational work that's required to keep a relationship strong, it's often not just that they have trauma in the way, though that could also be true. It could be that they have a pattern of thinking that they are stuck on that tells them, I don't have to do any of this. And this can be patterns that people internalize based on gender. So there can be things like, okay, well, if I'm a man, I don't have to talk about my feelings and I don't have to listen to my partner's feelings because that's what I learned as per the family and culture that I grew up in is not a man's job. We can also internalize the idea because I am uniquely troubled, I deserve to receive endless emotional support from my partners, even if it is exhausting them, even if they're unable to kind of keep up with the rest of their lives and responsibilities because I'm needing so much in terms of regulation from them. We can have these patterns of thinking that are not quite conscious, but that are driving the way we relate to people, that can make the conditions we're willing to have relationships under kind of unworkable for the average person. And if that's happening, a lot of the time, the problem is that it's happening on just a subconscious level enough that it's really hard to communicate about. So you kind of have to look at what people are refusing to engage with, including what you refuse to engage with in relationships if you have some form of entitlement patterning, which a lot of us with insecure attachment styles do. The only way this really ends up healing is by consciously surfacing what those entitled thought patterns are. A lot of these are products of the thinking that we picked up in our early environment, but that doesn't always mean that it's a trauma response, right? Sometimes it can just be a kind of cultural myth that we've inherited that does not pan out inside of the culture we find ourselves engaging with in adulthood, including insecure attachment culture, not translating very well to secure attachment culture. So people with enmeshed patterning often grow up thinking, okay, it's everybody else's job to check in with me constantly because that's how I relate. I suppress my needs, I check in with others, and then other people are supposed to do the same in reverse. And then if they meet a more secure person who just naturally advocates for what they want and need inside of a relationship, and who doesn't do that digging and endless trying to draw out of the other person what they secretly want, that person might feel like, well, now I'm entitled to kind of punish them in subtle ways or get passive aggressive because they didn't follow the rules. When in reality, that person has a totally different set of rules. And so looking at these patterns of what we get resentful about, but also where we feel entitled to not respond to people or to not care about someone who's feeling some form of distress, is often going to give us some insight into where we might have patterns of entitlement online. And if we can pull those up and examine them, then that's a wonderful thing that can genuinely reorient a lot of our worldviews. And Lundy Bancroft does have really awesome stuff on this. I'll link some of his stuff in the description of this video. But essentially, we're not going to communicate our way out of patterns of entitlement. The person who has them has to be willing to pull them up, examine them, and choose to change them. We might have entitlement around conflict. It might look like if someone is mean to me or says something to me that I don't like, I have the right to attack their character and call them names. Maybe this was the way that we saw conflict getting handled in our early environment, and so we assume that if we feel dysregulated, all bets are off. So when we're looking for our own entitlement, where we really want to start digging is any moment where we feel like we give ourselves permission to act in a way that is radically different. So maybe in our friendships, we never yell or we never stonewall or whatever it is. But in certain moments with our partners, we do that. And we want to start looking at what is this rule that I have that allows me to give myself permission in this area, but not this one. That often points at patterns of entitlement that are underlying our everyday thinking. At some point, I'll probably make a whole video on this because it's just such an interesting concept that I think kind of gets missed if we're only looking at psychology through the realm of trauma or emotion. Patterns of entitled thinking do not live in that realm. It's kind of a top-down process of our reasoning impacting the way that we approach things emotionally. The third thing that better communication cannot fix, though it can help you surface it, is fundamental underlying incompatibilities. So one person simply wants something out of their life that is very different than what the other person wants. And the ironic thing is that sometimes we can get so caught up in the high level conflict that is downstream of those underlying fundamental incompatibilities that we don't even see them for a very long time. So there's one time where I was in a relationship that was incredibly high conflict. And as my partner and I were working through different methods for helping with our conflict, at one point we sat down and did an exercise that was in one of the Gottman's workbooks. So John and Julie Gottman do a ton of great work on communication and relationships. And the point of the exercise was to help us map out our dreams and goals for our relationship. And by the time we sat down and shared with each other what we had come up with, we realized we want completely different things. We want different things in terms of family life. We want different things in terms of balance of stability versus variety. We want almost entirely different relationships. But we had spent so much time in conflict over small issues that we hadn't even taken the time to really sit down and figure out if we were aligned on the big things. And this is very often how it goes in relationships, right? What feels like a small fight is actually a much bigger fight. One person wanting to order food or go out for dinner more often than the other person, if we follow the thread all the way down, might actually, for those two people, be a fight about should we be saving for a house and a family or not. And if there are ways in which you're really misaligned on those big issues, all of the communication on earth is probably not going to solve that for you because you're going to be moving in different directions. Now, of course, where communication can help you is in surfacing those things. And the Gottmans are an awesome resource for surfacing that kind of stuff. So I always recommend their work if couples are struggling with are we compatible or not. But what's generally going to be useful in this case is just being able to zoom out on the relationship and look at what you're both wanting from it longer term and how that might be related to the conflicts that communication, for whatever reason, seem to just not be fixing for you. Fifth thing that better communication is not going to fix, this requires just a true shift of what each person is doing, is if unequal weight is being carried in the relationship. And of course, we all have our strengths and our weaknesses, and it's not like every relationship needs to be 50-50 in every single category. But especially if one person feels like they are really holding down the fort in a lot of different categories in the relationship, while their partner is just not pulling the same weight, that's likely going to be an issue that's not going to shift and the fights are not going to stop until that weight gets redistributed. So again, this doesn't mean that everyone needs to be doing half of the housework and half of the financial work and half of the communication work, but it does mean that one person doesn't feel like they are doing most of the work for two people, while the other person does very little of any of it. Relationships are made up of a lot of things, right? Especially if your lives are combined in some significant way that requires you to rely on each other. If one person is not following through on their commitments, if they're not upholding their end of the agreements that they make to contribute to the relationship in certain ways, none of that's really going to get solved until both people are following up on the commitments that they make to each other. Actual behavior has to change. Sixth thing that better communication is not going to fix is if one or both people are operating from severe distortions. Now, when I say the word distortions, I don't necessarily mean things like psychosis or other kind of severe forms of being out of touch with reality. What I mean is that if one person, or in a lot of cases both people, lacks the ability to interpret their partner properly because they have too many distortions in their own worldview that might be quite opposite from their partner's, it's going to be really hard to solve that with communication. So a kind of easy example of this is that there's a lot of distortions that are inherent to each insecure attachment style. And if we're unable to mentalize well for other people, which means to kind of step outside of our own frame of reasoning and put ourselves in someone else's headspace, which also means kind of being able to imagine what it's like to somatically be someone else on a day-to-day basis. And if we are always interpreting other people's actions through what it would mean if we were doing that, it's going to be really hard for any communication, even incredibly honest communication, to land. So if someone has the distortion, for example, that anytime someone is sharing vulnerably, they're trying to manipulate someone because that person has repressed their own vulnerability so much that it only comes out for them if they're trying to be manipulative. It's going to be so hard to resolve anything with that person because they're going to be making a fundamental assumption about what you are doing and saying that is missing your reality entirely. So, this is very similar to the entitlement piece, right? Distortions can give way to entitled patterns of thinking. But what we're really honing in on here is that if your words cannot arrive in your partner's brain and body in the way that you mean them, or vice versa, and in a lot of couples, I think this goes in both directions, it's going to be incredibly hard to resolve anything because things are constantly being taken out of context. And so the real, true information that exists inside of what we communicate with each other is routinely getting lost. And so this kind of thing often only resolves through attachment work, therapy, anything that kind of helps a person get aware of which distortions they are routinely making or which parts of their own thinking they're assuming applies to everybody when it really does not. This is often a very long road for a lot of people, but it does eventually bring them to the place where they're able to sit in front of another person and actually be attuned to them and present with them. And they're able to kind of parse apart what would I be meaning if I were saying that versus how does that meaning exist inside of this other person's worldview? And how are those things different? And last but not least, the seventh thing that better communication cannot fix in and of itself is any practical limitations that exist on the relationship's ability to thrive. So, one of my favorite examples of this is that I have a couple of friends who work in the field of organizational psychology. So, they look at things like workplace structures and how people are relating to each other in professional environments. And an insight that I frequently hear from those people is that sometimes you'll have two people who are kind of endlessly butting heads inside of a department in a workplace or whatever it is. And there are absolutely times when you just need to sit both people down and go, okay, let's talk about how to work through your personality differences and be more respectful with each other. But other times, there are forces inside of the organization that are kind of perpetually keeping people stuck in a conflict loop because person A is responsible for X and person B is responsible for Y. And the way that the organization is structured is that they're both going to be pressured to push up against each other quite frequently because there's kind of design flaws that's not allowing those people to cooperate well with each other, even if they want to. And so something it's really important to not lose sight of inside of our close relationships is what's happening for this person outside of the relationship that might be impacting them and might be impacting the way that we relate to each other. So as much as we can be annoyed when our spouse is frequently grumpy, if our spouse is also totally exhausted and overworked, it's unlikely that endlessly communicating about how they can be less grumpy is going to be anywhere near as effective as trying to figure out how things could be taken off their plate long term that gives them a chance to be more regulated. And of course, this does not mean that if other people are stressed out or under a lot of pressure, they get free license to treat other people badly, right? This philosophy ends where any sort of relational abuse begins. But there are a lot of instances where the things that end up causing conflict in the relationship are actually forces that are coming from outside of the relationship itself. So what we want to do with this one is, again, try to zoom out and look at both the changes you want to make in the relationship, but also the other person's capacity to truly make those changes and integrate them, right? We need to make sure that we're solving problems at the right level. So let's say one or both people really need therapy because they have those trauma responses that frequently are coming online. But as a unit, you can't afford therapy. Trying to figure out something like how do we stabilize ourselves financially so that we can invest in the support we need so that that can trickle back down into our relationship dynamic might be a much more fruitful line of inquiry than just how do we stop yelling at each other all of the time. And there are so many situations that this could apply to in different ways, right? Sometimes we're going through periods of extreme stress and our needs are just very different during those periods than they are during others. And so the relationship needs to frequently be doing kind of context checks in order to stay healthy. What are our needs as individuals and as a relationship unit this year relative to last year? And then next year will be totally different. Things do not work cleanly across all situations. And just staying aware of that And being willing to zoom out on the relationship and look at what's going into it from both sides, which relationship systems people are embedded in, what's going on with people's financial and professional lives, everything that impacts each person ends up impacting the relationship dynamic itself. And so losing sight of any of that is a very unwise move that might have us pointing fingers endlessly at one another when really the person we're pointing a finger at isn't totally able to do what we're asking them to do in the first place. So, with all of these, the idea is not that you want to drop communication. It's more that we can start holding communication that has gone awry in any of these scenarios as something that might be symptomatic of a deeper problem. And when we start tackling those problems at the core, having good, clear communication that's centered and non accusatory and all of that good stuff is absolutely going to help. But we want to make sure that we are treating the most core problem that we can find rather than endlessly circling around the symptoms that are just going to reemerge because we've not changed the underlying system that those problems arose out of. All right, I am going to leave things at that for today, but as always, any questions or thoughts that you had popping up as you've gone through this video, please leave them in the comment section below. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.